Thank you, Alex. Thanks everybody for turning up. Well, I've got a crib sheet today because this is the first time I've done this talk and it's still work in progress. So it's a bit like if you go to see a comedian who's doing their new material. It's the same sort of thing that they've got a script. So if you do have any feedback and it says I don't get that, then or I don't agree with that, then tough. Just no, please give us good constructive feedback. So that'd be really handy. Before we start, this is running my crypt. So who am I? That's me, Glenn Wilson, DevOps, Agile and Security Consultant. I'm currently looking for gigs. If anyone needs some support, then please come see me. I'm a published best-selling author. I like to use the word best-selling because I did actually get onto the bestsellers list on Amazon once. One hour only, I think. A public speaker. I'm also co-host of a podcast, DevSecOps Overflow, which we've had some really good guests recently, so do check it out. In fact, one of the guests on there, he did a very similar talk to what I'm going to do tonight, but he goes into a lot more detail. So if you want to get a bit more on that, that's one thing to go to. There's a guy called Marion Platt. And then we also have a meetup as well in London. It takes place every, it's like, it's every month, but it's on a Wednesday, usually the second or third Wednesday of the month. We've got one next Wednesday, so if you're interested in coming along, we've got to talk about threats and risks, so that could be a good one. And it's quite easy to get to as well. It's in Liverpool Street, right next to the station, so easy to get to. Oh, and also I'm a former champion powerlifter, former boxer, and I run for fun apparently. So, the title of this talk is about going from chaotic security engineering to secure chaos engineering. But I just want to frame it first, and so we understand what we mean by chaotic security engineering. And I'm starting with risk. So when I start with risk, what I'm trying to say here is that we've got risk is measured by looking at the likelihood and the impact. And the idea is we take the likelihood and the impact and we translate that into a metric, which we then say is our risk of our organisation. So, if it's a high likelihood and a high impact, it's a high risk. If it's a low impact and a low likelihood, it's a low risk. But in between that, there's a whole bunch of different scales within that you can measure apparently. The trouble is we can't measure it. And what we end up seeing is conflated red, amber, greens all over the place, which then tells us whether our system is secure or how risk is carried over in our system. Now, there's a massive problem with that, in my mind. First of all, likelihood. How can we measure likelihood of something happening? You could say, oh, it's a low likelihood, and it happens tomorrow. So what does that tell us? And it's also dynamic as well. So likelihood could change over time. There could be more and more likelihood of something going wrong over a larger period of time. And likewise with impact as well. How can we measure impact on something when we don't really understand what that impact is? We can understand what the blast radius is, but if someone gives up their credentials to a phishing attack, what's the impact of that? Is that going to lead to a ransomware that brings down the whole organisation for several weeks? Or is it just going to mean that person has their credit card details stolen and that's it? From an organisation perspective, the impact is a lot different. So it's very difficult to manage what risk means in terms of security. So what we're trying to do right now is do that. How many people here do risk assessments on their software or on their products or their organisation? There's a lady called Nancy Neverson who wrote a paper, and she suggested that actually we shouldn't be looking at likelihood and impact. We should just be talking about plausibility. What's the plausibility that I could have a ransomware attack anytime? Is it high or is it low? And just take that as your risk. So rather than trying to look at each of the different components, so a piece of software, a piece of infrastructure, and whatever you've got in between all that, and trying to measure the risk of each of those and then trying to build up a big picture, what Nancy's saying is just think about the plausibility of how risk or how something might happen in our organisation. So that may be an alternative. If you're interested in that, I can give you the details of that paper. yeah, so that's what the problem is with risk. Now, this is a drawing by a guy called Jens Rasmussen. And Jens Rasmussen, he says that what happens in organisations is that we tend to drift into failure. So what we mean by drifting into failure is that at the moment we're all up to this sort of like a constraint. We have boundary to economic failure with an organisation. If we don't make money as an organisation, we go over that boundary and we lose money. And the company collapses if you lose too much money. And we've just seen that just recently with some Bitcoin companies, crypto coin companies, FTX for example, which is just disappeared because they went over their boundary to economic failure. You've also got boundary to unacceptable workload. So if you overwork your workers, they're going to complain, they're going to get burnout, they're going to not be able to do their work, and again your company starts to feel stress. And although it's less likely to happen than an economic failure, there are failures where organisations lead to significant burnout. So these two boundaries are, if you can imagine this as being like a springboard, what the organisation tries to do is they try to push as far away from those two boundaries as possible. We don't want economic failure, we don't want burnout, we don't want to overload resources, we don't want to pay for the resources. So what we try to do is we put pressure towards least effort, and we put pressure towards efficiency. But what that does is it pushes closer and closer to where we might have security failure. And we don't actually know where that boundary lies. We don't know what a security failure looks like. We can't measure. We can measure our economic failure. Right? We know what money goes in, what money goes out. We can measure what our economic failure looks like. We can probably measure what our workload looks like as well. We know what 100% capacity looks like, and we know if we go beyond that, that's where we're going to have risk. But with security, how the hell do we measure security? How do we know where we are on this boundary? So when Rasmussen and Decker talk about drifting into failure, what I mean is that rather than being comfortable in this spot, we end up here. We end up outside of our failure area. And we've seen this in safety. So think about both the Challenger and the Discovery. Is it Discovery? Yeah. Failures. In both of those, the evidence suggests that the whole of the organisation drifted into failure. What happened with them is that, take the first example, with the Challenger, there was an O-ring. The O-ring, we knew it contracted when the weather got cold. We knew it happened, and when you asked all the engineers, they just said, oh yeah, we know that happens. That's fine, it happens all the time, we're okay. So when that Challenger took off in freezing cold conditions, with the freezing cold or sub-zero temperatures of the hydrogen and oxygen that was pumped into it, the O-ring never heated up. And as a result of never heating up, it was too small for its fit, and therefore there was a catastrophic leak and a catastrophic explosion. But that naturally drifted into failure. The very same thing that happened with this Discovery with the foam. The foam fell off the outside of the boosters all the time, and it wasn't a problem. But that one time it was a problem. That's when it drifted into failure. So if we turn that back into security, how often do we say, oh yeah, we run that scan and that particular defect appears all the time? That's fine. It might be fine today, it might be fine tomorrow, but one day that can be your Achilles heel, that can bring you down, that could be your challenge problem. So drifting into failure is something you want to avoid. But what we need to do that is we need to understand where our error margin is. Is there an error margin? Where can we go to where we feel that we are still safe? And in the safety context, that's still being debated and still being looked at. I have a proposal for security, which I will talk about in a minute. But that's what we talk about when we say drifting into failure. We're drifting into security failure when we just let security things happen because they always happen. And we see that a lot. I see that a lot. So just be wary of drifting into failure. Oh, question marks. Okay, blank slide. What means? Another way of looking at it is by saying, well, okay, if we've got these security risks that we can't measure and we're drifting into security problems, then what happens is the organisation says, right, we're going to take a more prescriptive and authoritative stance on this, and we're going to start implementing controls. Right? So we start implementing controls on the work that's done. We have work is done. You're all developers, I think. You know what work is done means. You're doing that work all the time. Yeah? If when you're in your own mind, you know exactly what you do. The people that are setting the controls, the security controls, they imagine what you're doing. They don't know exactly what you're doing, so they imagine what you're doing. And it's not necessarily what you are doing. So when they're telling you, oh, you need to implement this control, that's based on what they think you do. Some of it might be okay, but the vast majority of it isn't. Yeah? So you might also say, well, we don't do work like that, we do it like this. You disclose the work, but you don't disclose it in a way that is comprehensive of what you do on a day-to-day basis. You give the highlights, you give a subjective view on what you do on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, what you're actually doing and what you're disclosing is still very small, but it conflates what is imagined. So again, when the governance teams are telling you what you need to be doing, they're basically work as imagined and work as disclosed, which is a very small overlap. And then finally you get to work as prescribed. So now they're prescribing work to you. So they're saying this is what we think you should do to secure your products. So you go off and you do what you think, most of what they think you should be doing, but you do this huge bit that you should be doing. You're doing other stuff. So in all of this, we've got a very small overlap in what actually work is being done. So as a result, it's very difficult to implement security controls. If we can't implement security controls in a way the developers accept them, then they're not going to accept them, and as a result, we're going to be at a greater risk of security breaches because we don't have the right controls in the right places when we need them. And this is this diagram is by a guy called Steve Shorrock. There's a link there if you want to view more. He's written a nice good article, gives you a bit more details about all of this, but it's an interesting one. So, another problem we have, why it's so chaotic, is complexity. We have such complex systems. Now, what do I mean by complexity? So, what I mean by complexity is you have a system of interrelated components, and those components, they could be APIs, they could be microservices, and that's fine. But then if you start adding human elements into that, social interactions, communication channels, then you start seeing a little bit more complexity in everything you're doing. And what I mean by the human element is the subjectivity of every human. I reckon, you developers, if I sat you down there and said, right, debate something about software security, we were talking earlier about polymorphism, right? Is polymorphism a good thing or a bad thing? You've got probably 6 different views on whether polymorphism is a good thing or a bad thing. And that adds to the complexity of, well, should we implement them or not? How do we implement them? Should we not implement them? And so forth. So there's complexity that way as well. And we're working in this complex environment. So if we're trying to implement security, how do we implement security in an environment that's so complex? It becomes very, very difficult to do. If I told, I think we should do it this way. So if you're doing a code review and someone says, I think you should do it this way, then and someone disagrees, then surely that's going to create more issues than it's going to solve, and therefore create more complexity in the whole system. And we did start off years ago with very simple products, very simple services, and it'd just be like a monolith, maybe a back-end database and a front end, and it was very easy to do. But we've progressively drifted away from that, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier about drifting into failure again. Because there's so much complexity, it's far more difficult to actually understand where our weaknesses are within our software. So our software has become way too complex, or our systems, let's say, not software, our systems have become way too complex for us to manage on a day-to-day basis from a security perspective. there are too many unknowns. And, you know, there are things that happen in our system that we don't understand how they happen, and there are things that we don't even see happen that are happening all the time. So it is very complex what we're living in now. So the paradigms I've just been talking about, so doing things like risk assessments, threat analysis, and implementing controls, and all that sort of stuff is great. It's a great thing we can do, right? And we've been doing it for a long time. Yet, if you look at the latest statistics, there was a statistic came out last week, I should say, about the whole of 2022, that the number of breaches in 2022 was the highest number of breaches ever that we've seen, right? Maybe it's probably because of the Ukraine-Russia war that's probably been a factor, but we've seen more breaches in 2022 than we did in any other year. We're doing something wrong. Something's not working, because we've also invested more money into security than we've ever done before, and yet we're not getting the results from that investment. We're not seeing more secure systems. We're seeing more breaches. We're seeing more ransomware attacks. We're seeing more leaks of data from government and public sectors and public services. We were talking about some earlier. You know, LastPass was one. There's one on the FAA yesterday, which grounded flights in the USA. And I think that one also, they reckon it might have been the same ransomware that affected the overseas Royal Mail system as well. So these things are happening at ever greater frequency, and they're becoming more sophisticated as well. When I say they're becoming more sophisticated, what they're doing is they're exploiting the weaknesses in their complexity. Because we've got so many complex systems, they're exploiting those weaknesses. So we need a new paradigm. We need to go off in a different direction, because the direction we're going down right now I don't think is working. And this is where I come on to security chaos engineering. So chaos engineering came from the idea that when a butterfly flaps its wing in Brazil, a tornado happened in Texas. And the reason why that happens is because from the moment that butterfly flaps its wings, there's a whole bunch of interactions that are going on, feedback loops, different like causal loops as well. So one thing happens and leads to another thing, leads to another thing. So eventually we get a hurricane or a tornado in Texas. It's a really complex system, really complex. So because of the complexity, the chaos is difficult to measure where that chaos happens. But this is what chaos means.
The butterfly species is not in Brazil, by the way. It's Mexico. But
it's an Brazil is the same. Butterfly flaps its wing in Brazil in the jungle.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the official. I've got a link on here. I did have a link to the actual paper where that first came up. Yeah.
So the example is butterfly in Brazil, but this is not a butterfly that lives in Brazil.
Oh, I see. Oh no, that was just a type.
So if we can
That's
catch that butterfly, we're all right.
That's but then if he flaps his wing to get away, this is a tornado in Texas.
Honestly, that's why I left Brazil. I can't trust the butterflies.
Well, who knows, if it flapped its wing, you know, might end up to some sort of like state takeover or something. But that's what chaos means. Weather systems is a really good idea of what chaos is. And the thing that is very difficult to do is to predict. So when you've got a chaos, it's difficult to predict chaos. But we're right there now with security. We're right in an area where everything's happening through chaos. And as a result, there's unpredictability, there's volatility, there's uncertainty, and there's ambiguity in what we're doing. So, I've got how many units have I got? How many units have I got to the break?
Well, we're about 20 minutes in.
About 20 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to go for a bit more, or do you want to pause there?
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just do a couple of pages. So the Security Chaos Engineering. Really good report by O'Reilly, Aaron Reinhardt and Ken Shortridge. They're both friends of mine. And if you want to get hold of this report, there's a QR code there. Trust me, that does work. Test it earlier. It's not going to take you down some sort of site. You don't have to give your credentials over. What this book does is it's written by Aaron Reinhardt, who worked with Casey Rosenthal and Nora Jones at Netflix. And Netflix introduced something called chaos engineering, and you may have heard of chaos monkeys. The whole idea of this is that they don't like framing it this way, but the way that it has to be framed outside of Netflix is that you take a monkey, put him in a server room, he pulls out cables, and randomly things go wrong. And you should be able to be resilient to that. That's the whole idea of what chaos engineering is. And that was written by, say, Nora Jones and Casey Rosenthal. They're the ones that developed it. But Aaron worked with them, and he and Kelly then took this to another level and looked at security chaos engineering. Okay. So they define chaos engineering in the book, and quite a long bit of text there, but the ones that I've underlined there are the keywords. So it's continual experimentation. We're continually doing stuff. We don't do stuff every now and again, we do it all the time. It is a process that is baked into our BAU, basically. And what we do with those experiments is we uncover systemic weaknesses, so not individual weaknesses, but systemic weaknesses, and so weaknesses that affect the whole system. And it also helps us to learn what we don't know. We expose things that we don't know, so it increases our understanding. And by doing that, it gives us greater confidence in our systems. Because if we can understand our systems and do something about it, we can get greater confidence that we are doing the right thing. I did talk about these breaches a moment ago. I don't think Netflix has ever had a security breach. So it might be worth considering that as well. But yeah, so we did talk about improving the resilience of an organisation through security chaos engineering. What I mean by resilience is being able to adapt to any situation that occurs, not because you are rehearsed in dealing with a specific situation, but you're rehearsed in dealing with situations. And because you can deal with situations, you can deal with any specific situation. But you need to be trained in doing that. So it's no point, you know, it's like say let's take something really simple as doing backups, right? So I say backups. A backup is a backup unless you restore it. Now, if you did that backup and restore it on a day-to-day basis, you'll learn how it's done. But then what happens if you get a ransomware attack? That's not necessarily a backup problem, but if you know how to deal with backups, you might be better off knowing how to deal with ransomware. You're not going to be panicking as much. You're going to know some tools. You're going to have some skills that help you get around that problem. Maybe not immediately, but it certainly builds that sort of resilience into your workforce. So what it basically allows you to do is it allows the organisation to perform under different conditions, and they're either expected conditions or unexpected conditions. So you can build that resilience that way. What is very important is don't confuse it with being robust. Robust is purely defensive. So robust is about being able to fix a problem straight away. I'll say that again. It's about being able to not let that problem happen in the first place. And it's trying to build these controls into your system and fix the problems that way. So if you're being robust, it means that you're adding more and more controls to your system. I'm trying to think of an example, but my mind's gone. So there are two core principles of security chaos engineering. The first one is that it's okay to fail, and by failure you prepare for failure. So that's the first one. The second one is it's not about trying to replicate incidents, it's about being able to manage incidents when they do occur. So they're the two core concepts of security chaos engineering. I'm just going to do this one more slide while I'm on break. But in order to do doing security chaos engineering, or any sort of chaos engineering, you need a really good monitoring system. You need to have the ability to measure your systems. Going back to what I said earlier about how we're drifting into failure, we don't know how to measure our systems. But actually we can measure some elements. We can measure a lot of stuff that we're doing. And these could be leading indicators of whether we're actually getting towards that failure line. So that line I showed you earlier, which is the three boundaries, that security failure boundary. If we're drifting towards that, we should be able to see the leading indicators that tell us that we're drifting towards that, and then we can pull back. So we do need to have very good monitoring in place, and this is where security chaos engineering can help us resolve that, because with security chaos engineering, we need to be able to measure what we're doing. If we can't measure what we're doing, we can't do security chaos engineering. So it forces us to build in and measuring metrics into our systems. So I'm happy to take a break there if people have a coffee break.